The desert sun blazed mercilessly overhead as Jake Mitchell wiped the sweat from his brow, squinting across the endless expanse of red rock and scrub brush. He had been hiking for 3 days through the Sonoran Desert, documenting plant species. For his botanical research, when he took a wrong turn somewhere near the Arizona-Mexico border, his GPS had died the previous morning and his water supply was running dangerously low. Jake was a quiet man in his early 30s, more comfortable with plants than people. He had dedicated his life to studying desert flora, finding peace in the solitude of vast landscapes where cacti and hardy shrubs fought for survival against impossible odds. This research trip was supposed to be routine, a chance to catalog rare species in one of the most remote corners of the American Southwest. As he stumbled over loose rocks, his boots worn thin from days of walking, Jake heard something that made him freeze. It was barely audible over the wind whistling through the canyon walls, but it sounded like someone crying. He strained his ears, wondering if the heat was playing tricks on his mind. Desert mirages weren't just visual, he had heard. Sometimes, the isolation could make you hear things that weren't there, but there it was again, a soft whimpering carried on the hot breeze. Jake dropped his heavy backpack and followed the sound, his heart pounding as he navigated around a cluster of massive boulders. What he found made his stomach drop. A young, Native American girl, probably no more than 16, lay crumpled against the base of a towering rock formation. Her traditional dress was torn and dirty, her long black hair matted with dust and dried blood from a gash on her forehead. She was barely conscious, her lips cracked and bleeding from severe dehydration. Her breathing was shallow and labored, and Jake could see that she had been here for at least a day, maybe longer. The girl's dark eyes fluttered open when she heard his approaching footsteps and she tried to speak, but only managed a hoarse whisper in what sounded like Apache. Jake didn't hesitate. He rushed back to his pack and grabbed his remaining water bottle, less than half full but enough to potentially save her life. Returning to her side, he gently lifted her head and pressed the bottle to her cracked lips. She drank eagerly, desperately, small sips at first and then longer pulls as her body responded to the life-giving liquid. As the girl regained some strength, Jake tried to communicate with her using hand gestures and the few Spanish words he knew, but it was clear she spoke Apache as her first language. She managed to convey that her name sounded like Ayana, which Jake later learned meant eternal blossom in her language. She pointed weakly toward the mountains in the distance, indicating where her people might be, but Jake realized it would take days to reach any settlement on foot. The girl was in no condition to travel, and Jake was down to his last energy bar and a few sips of water. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Jake made a decision that would change his life forever. He would stay with Ayana through the night, sharing what little he had while hoping that help would find them both. He didn't know that among the Apache people, the act of sharing water during a time of mortal danger carried profound spiritual and legal significance. In the ancient traditions that still governed many aspects of tribal life, when someone saved another's life by sharing their most precious resource in the desert, it created bonds that transcended ordinary human relationships. Water was sacred, life itself, and to share it meant accepting responsibility for that person's well-being. As darkness fell across the desert, Jake built a small shelter using his jacket and some branches, trying to keep Ayana warm as the temperature dropped dramatically. She drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling words in Apache that Jake couldn't understand. He stayed awake all night, watching over her and rationing the last few drops of water between them. Jake had no idea that miles away, Ayana's family and tribal elders were desperately searching for her. She had been gathering medicinal plants for her grandmother when she had fallen and hit her head on the rocks, becoming disoriented and lost in the maze of canyons. Her disappearance had mobilized dozens of tribal members who knew these ancient lands like the back of their hands. What Jake also didn't know was that Ayana came from a prominent family within the Apache Nation. Her grandfather was a respected elder and medicine man, and her father served on the tribal council. Their family had maintained many of the old traditions, including laws and customs that had governed Apache society for centuries before European contact. As the first light of dawn crept across the desert floor, Jake heard the distant sound of voices calling in Apache. Help was finally coming. But he had no idea that his simple act of human decency was about to thrust him into a complex web of ancient traditions, cultural misunderstandings, and legal obligations that he never could have imagined. The rescue, that he hoped would end this ordeal, was actually just the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about love, duty, and the power of human connection across cultural divides. The voices grew louder as a group of Apache search party members appeared over the ridge, their faces showing relief, mixed with concern when they spotted Ayanna and the strange white man sitting beside her. Jake stood up slowly, his hands raised in a peaceful gesture, trying to show he meant no harm. The lead searcher, a weathered man in his 50s with traditional braids and modern hiking gear, called out sharply in Apache before switching to accented English. "Step away from the girl," he commanded, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. The tension in the air was thick as the other tribal members spread out in a semicircle around Jake and Ayanna. Jake could see the suspicion in their eyes, the assumption that he might be responsible for her condition rather than her savior. Ayanna stirred at the sound of familiar voices, managing to lift her head and speak weakly in Apache. Her words caused an immediate change in the searcher's demeanor. The lead man, who Jake later learned was Ayanna's Uncle Thomas, knelt beside his niece and listened intently as she explained what had happened. She pointed to Jake and then to the empty water bottle beside them, her voice growing stronger as she recounted how the strange botanist had found her near death and shared his last water to keep her alive. Thomas stood up slowly, his dark eyes studying Jake with new respect and something else that Jake couldn't quite identify. It looked almost like concern, as if Jake had unknowingly stepped into something much bigger than a simple rescue. The uncle spoke rapidly to the other searchers in Apache, and Jake noticed their expressions shift from suspicion to a mixture of gratitude and what seemed like worry. "You gave her water," Thomas said to Jake, his words carrying weight that Jake didn't understand. "All your water? When you had little left?" "Of course I did," Jake replied, confused by the solemnity in Thomas's voice. "She was dying. Anyone would have done the same thing." Thomas exchanged meaningful glances with the other tribal members before speaking again. "Not anyone. And not like this. You stayed with her through the night. You protected her when she could not protect herself. You shared life itself when death was near." Two of the searchers carefully lifted Ayanna onto an improvised stretcher made from branches and blankets. She reached out weakly and grasped Jake's hand, saying something in Apache that made several of the men nod gravely. Thomas translated with obvious reluctance. "She says you are her guardian now, her protector. She says the spirits brought you to save her when her own people could not find her." Jake felt uncomfortable with the spiritual implications but brushed it off as gratitude mixed with traumatic stress. "I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. Anyone would have helped." The journey back to the Apache reservation took most of the day, with Jake following the search party through terrain that seemed impossible to navigate, without intimate knowledge of every rock formation and hidden path. The tribal members moved with practiced ease through landscapes that would have been Jake's death sentence if he had continued wandering alone. As they walked, Thomas explained that Ayanna was the granddaughter of Henry Yazzie, one of the most respected medicine men and tribal elders in their community. Her family held significant influence in matters of traditional law and customs, which made her rescue by an outsider particularly significant. "Our ways are old," Thomas said as they navigated a narrow canyon. "Older than the reservations, older than the federal government, older than the borders drawn on white man's maps. Some laws cannot be changed by Congress or courts. They are written in the hearts of our people and witnessed by the spirits of our ancestors." Jake nodded politely, assuming this was just cultural context that would help him understand the family's gratitude. He was already planning his exit strategy, figuring he would accept their thanks graciously, maybe share a meal, and then continue his botanical research in a different area of the desert. When they finally reached the reservation settlement, word of their arrival had already spread. Dozens of tribal members gathered around as the stretcher bearing Ayanna was carried to the medical clinic, a modern building that stood in stark contrast to some of the traditional dwellings scattered throughout the community. Jake felt the weight of many eyes upon him, studying his face and manner with intense curiosity. An elderly woman who could only be Ayanna's grandmother emerged from the clinic, her weathered face creased with worry until she saw her granddaughter alive and conscious. She spoke rapidly in Apache to the stretcher bearers, then turned her attention to Jake. Her eyes were sharp and intelligent, seeming to look right through him as Thomas explained in their native language what had transpired in the desert. The grandmother approached Jake slowly, her traditional dress rustling in the evening breeze. When she spoke, her English was clear despite her heavy accent. "You shared water with my granddaughter when she was dying." "Yes, ma'am." "I couldn't just leave her there." The old woman studied his face for a long moment, then said something in Apache that caused murmurs to ripple through the gathered crowd. Thomas looked uncomfortable as he translated. "She says you have kind eyes but do not understand what you have done. She says you will learn soon enough." Jake was beginning to feel like everyone was speaking in riddles, but he attributed it to cultural differences and the emotional stress of the rescue. A younger tribal member, probably in his 20s and wearing modern clothes, approached and introduced himself as David, Ayana's cousin who had studied at Arizona State University. "Thank you for saving her," David said, shaking Jake's hand firmly. "But I think you should know that things might get complicated. Some of our people still follow very old customs about life debts and marriage laws. The council will need to meet about this." "Marriage laws?" Jake felt a chill run down his spine despite the warm evening air. "What does marriage have to do with anything?" David glanced nervously at his elders who were watching the conversation intently. "In the old ways, when a man saves a woman's life by sharing water in the desert, especially staying with her through the night to protect her, it creates certain obligations. Bonds that our ancestors considered sacred." Jake's mouth went dry as he began to understand the magnitude of what he had stumbled into. His simple act of human decency had apparently triggered some ancient legal mechanism that he had never heard of and definitely never consented to. As the crowd began to disperse and Ayana was taken inside the clinic for treatment, Jake realized his ordeal in the desert was nothing compared to the cultural and legal maze he was about to navigate. 3 days passed before Jake was summoned to appear before the tribal council. 3 days during which he stayed in a modest guest house on the reservation while Ayana recovered from her ordeal. The delay gave him time to research Apache customs online, using the community center's internet connection, and what he discovered made his stomach churn with anxiety. The Apache people had indeed maintained ancient laws regarding life debts and marriage contracts that predated European contact by centuries. According to several anthropological sources, Jake found sharing water with a dying person of the opposite sex, particularly involving an overnight vigil, could be interpreted as a marriage proposal under certain traditional circumstances. The custom was designed to ensure that vulnerable people would always have someone committed to their protection and welfare. David visited Jake each evening, trying to prepare him for what might happen at the council meeting. The young Apache man had grown up straddling two worlds, understanding both traditional ways and modern American legal systems, which put him in a unique position to help Jake navigate this cultural minefield. "The thing you have to understand," David explained as they sat on the guest house porch watching the sunset, "is that for many of our elders these traditional laws are just as real and binding as anything in your courts. They believe the spirits witnessed your actions and created a sacred bond between you and Ayana." Jake ran his hands through his hair in frustration. "But I didn't know about any of this. I was just trying to save her life. How can I be held responsible for laws I never knew existed?" "That's what makes this complicated," David admitted. "In traditional Apache law, ignorance doesn't absolve responsibility. The act itself creates the obligation, regardless of the person's knowledge or intentions. It's like gravity. It works whether you understand physics or not." The morning of the council meeting arrived gray and windy, with storm clouds gathering over the mountains in the distance. Jake dressed in his best clothes, a simple button-down shirt and khaki pants that seemed woefully inadequate for the formal proceedings he was about to face. David escorted him to the tribal council building, a large circular structure built in traditional style with modern amenities. Inside, 12 tribal elders sat in a semicircle, their faces grave and thoughtful. Jake recognized some of them from the day of the rescue, including Thomas and Ayana's grandmother, who wore traditional dress that marked her as a person of significant status within the community. At the center of the semicircle sat Henry Yazzie, Ayana's grandfather, whose weathered face bore the wisdom of 8 decades of life on the reservation. Ayana herself was present, looking much healthier but still pale from her ordeal. She wore a beautiful traditional dress and sat beside her grandmother, her dark eyes fixed on the floor as the proceedings began. Jake felt a pang of guilt seeing her there, wondering if his rescue had somehow trapped her in this awkward situation as much as it had trapped him. Henry Yazzie spoke first in Apache, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and respected. Thomas translated for Jake's benefit, explaining that the council had gathered to discuss a matter of traditional law that had implications for both the Apache Nation and the outside world. "My granddaughter has told us of your actions in the desert," Henry said, switching to English out of respect for Jake's presence. "You found her dying and shared your water, knowing it might mean your own death. You stayed with her through the night, protecting her from wild animals in the cold. In our ways, this creates powerful obligations." Jake stood up when invited to speak, his legs shaky with nervousness. "Honored elders, I want you to know that I acted purely from humanitarian instinct. I would have done the same for anyone I found in that condition, regardless of their age, gender, or ethnicity. I had no knowledge of Apache customs and certainly no intention of entering into any kind of marriage contract." His words were translated for the elders who didn't speak English, and Jake watched their faces for any sign of understanding or sympathy. Most remained impassive, though he thought he detected a hint of approval from one elderly woman when he mentioned his humanitarian motives. Henry Yazzie nodded thoughtfully before responding. "Your intentions were good and we honor that. But intentions alone do not change what occurred. In the desert, witnessed by the spirits in the sacred mountains, you entered into the ancient ritual of water sharing. This creates responsibilities that cannot be dismissed simply because you were unaware of them." Ayana's grandmother stood up and spoke rapidly in Apache, gesturing toward her granddaughter and then toward Jake. Her words sparked animated discussion among the council members, with several of them responding in their native language. The debate went on for nearly an hour, with Jake sitting in uncomfortable silence while his fate was discussed in words he couldn't understand. Finally, Henry Yazzie called for order and addressed Jake directly. "There are some among us who believe the traditional law must be followed exactly as our ancestors established it. In their view, you are now bound to my granddaughter as her husband and protector, regardless of your wishes or knowledge of our customs." Jake felt his heart hammering in his chest, but Henry continued before he could respond. "However, there are others who believe that the law was created in a time when all people understood our ways. They argue that applying it to someone who acted in ignorance would be unjust and contrary to the spirit of our traditions." David, who had been serving as an unofficial cultural interpreter, was invited to speak. He stood up and addressed the council in Apache before switching to English. "I propose a middle path," David said. "Jake Mitchell has proven himself to be a man of honor by his actions in the desert. But he is also a man of a different culture, who stumbled into our traditional laws without understanding them. Perhaps there is a way to honor both the ancient customs and the reality of our modern situation." The council members exchanged glances and spoke quietly among themselves. Jake noticed that Ayana had finally looked up and was watching him with an expression he couldn't read. Was it gratitude? Curiosity? Fear? He realized that she was probably just as trapped in this situation as he was, bound by traditions that gave her little choice in the matter. As the afternoon wore on and storm clouds continued to gather outside, Jake began to understand that this wasn't just about him anymore. The decision made here would set a precedent for how the Apache Nation dealt with the intersection of ancient laws and modern realities. His accidental rescue of Ayana had become a test case that could influence tribal policy for generations to come. The council deliberations continued for 3 more days, during which Jake was allowed to move freely around the reservation, but asked not to leave until a decision was reached. The delay gave him an unexpected opportunity to experience Apache culture firsthand and to get to know Ayana beyond the traumatic circumstances of their first meeting. Ayana had recovered quickly from her physical injuries, but Jake could see that the emotional weight of their situation troubled her deeply. She was caught between respecting her grandfather's traditional authority and her own desire for self-determination. During their cautious conversations, Jake learned that she was actually 18, older than he had initially thought, and was studying to become a nurse at a college in Phoenix. "I want you to know," she told him as they walked near the reservation's small lake on the second day, "that I never asked for this to happen. The water-sharing tradition is real and it saved my life. but I don't believe anyone should be forced into marriage because of ancient laws. Jake appreciated her honesty and found himself genuinely liking her intelligence and strength. She spoke passionately about her plans to bring modern healthcare to reservation communities and her dreams of bridging the gap between traditional healing practices and contemporary medicine. Under different circumstances, he might have been interested in getting to know her better, but the coercive nature of their situation made any romantic feelings impossible. "What do you want to happen?" Jake asked her directly. Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, watching a hawk circle overhead. "I want to honor my grandfather and our traditions, but I also want to choose my own path. Maybe there's a way to do both." That evening, Ayanna surprised everyone by asking to address the tribal council herself. It was unusual for someone so young to speak directly to the elders on such a weighty matter, but her status as the person most directly affected by their decision gave her the right to be heard. She stood before the council with dignity beyond her years, speaking first in Apache and then in English for Jake's benefit. "Honored elders, I am grateful to Jake Mitchell for saving my life, and I understand the sacred nature of the water-sharing ritual. But I believe our ancestors created these laws to protect and provide for people, not to trap them in unwanted obligations." Her grandmother looked proud, but worried, as Ayanna continued. "I propose that we honor the spirit of the traditional law while adapting it to our current reality. Jake has already proven his character and his commitment to protecting me when I needed it most. Perhaps there is a way to acknowledge this bond without requiring a marriage that neither of us desires." Henry Yazzie leaned forward in his chair, clearly interested in his granddaughter's perspective. "What do you suggest, granddaughter?" "I suggest we create a ceremonial kinship bond," Ayanna said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "In our tradition, adoption and spiritual kinship are as sacred as marriage. Jake could become my ceremonial brother, bound to protect and support me and our family, but free to live his own life and make his own choices about marriage and family." The council members exchanged surprised glances. This was an innovative solution that none of them had considered, one that honored traditional concepts while addressing the modern reality of their situation. David looked impressed by his cousin's diplomatic skills, while Jake felt a surge of hope that there might be a way out of this dilemma that wouldn't dishonor anyone. An elderly council member named Robert Crow Feather spoke up in Apache, and Thomas translated for Jake. He says this is an interesting proposal, but he wonders what obligations Jake would accept as a ceremonial brother. The law exists to ensure protection and support, not just to honor tradition. Jake stood up, realizing this was his chance to contribute constructively to the solution. "If the council would accept Ayanna's proposal, I would be honored to become her ceremonial brother. I would commit to being available if she or her family ever needed help, whether that's medical emergencies, financial support, or just having someone to call in times of trouble. I may not live here, but I could be reached quickly and would take any request for help seriously." He paused, thinking about what he could offer that would be meaningful. "I'm a botanist, and I know that traditional medicine is important to your people. I could work with your healers to document and preserve knowledge about medicinal plants, maybe even help develop sustainable cultivation programs for rare species. It would be a way to give back to the community that welcomed me during this difficult time." The offer seemed to resonate with several council members, particularly the older women who were keepers of much traditional plant knowledge. Ayanna's grandmother spoke up for the first time since the proceedings began, her words causing thoughtful nods around the circle. Thomas translated. "She says that Jake's offer to help preserve plant knowledge shows he understands what is truly valuable to our people. She believes this could be a marriage of minds and spirits without being a marriage of bodies." Henry Yazzie called for a recess, so the council could discuss this new proposal in private. Jake and Ayanna were asked to wait outside while the elders debated the merits of creating this unprecedented ceremonial kinship bond. As they sat together on a bench outside the council building, watching children play in the dusty street, Jake felt a strange sense of peace settling over him. "Your proposal was brilliant," he told Ayanna. "You found a way to honor your traditions while preserving both of our freedoms." "I hope so," she replied. "My grandfather is a good man, but he worries about losing our culture to the modern world. If we can show him that traditions can evolve without being destroyed, maybe it will help him and the other elders find ways to keep our heritage alive for future generations." When the council reconvened an hour later, Henry Yazzi's expression was more relaxed than it had been in days. "The council has reached a decision," he announced. "We will accept Ayana's proposal to create a ceremonial kinship bond between Jake Mitchell and our family. This honors the sacred act of water sharing while recognizing the different world we live in today." Relief flooded through Jake, but Henry wasn't finished speaking. "However, this bond will not be just symbolic. Jake will participate in a traditional adoption ceremony and will be considered a son of our family from that day forward. He will have obligations and rights within our community, and we will have obligations to him as well." The medicine man stood up slowly, his weathered face showing both solemnity and warmth. "You came into our desert as a stranger and left it as family. The spirits work in mysterious ways, Jake Mitchell. Perhaps this was always meant to be your path." As storm clouds finally opened up and began dropping rain on the dusty reservation, Jake realized his life had just taken a turn he never could have imagined. He wasn't just escaping an unwanted marriage. He was gaining an entire extended family and a connection to a culture that was as ancient as the mountains surrounding them. The adoption ceremony was scheduled for the following weekend, giving Jake time to prepare both practically and emotionally for what would be a life-changing ritual. Ayana and her family spent the intervening days teaching him about Apache customs and the significance of the various elements he would experience during the ceremony. "This isn't just about making you legally part of our family," Ayana explained as she helped him understand the spiritual aspects of the ritual. "In our beliefs, you'll be taking on the spiritual protection of our ancestors and accepting responsibility for carrying our traditions forward. It's a serious commitment." Jake found himself both nervous and genuinely moved by the gravity of what was happening. He had come to the desert as a solitary researcher, someone who preferred the company of plants to people, and now he was about to become part of an extended family that included not just the living members but generations of ancestors whose spirits were believed to watch over the clan. Henry Yazzie took personal responsibility for preparing Jake spiritually for the ceremony. The elderly medicine man spent hours with him each day, sharing stories about Apache history and explaining the philosophical foundations of their culture. Jake was surprised to discover how many parallels existed between Apache spiritual beliefs and his own scientific understanding of interconnection in natural ecosystems. "Everything is connected," Henry told him as they sat together watching the sunrise over the mountains. "The plants you study, the animals that eat them, the soil that feeds them, the rain that nourishes them, and the people who respect them. Our traditions recognize these connections and teach us how to live in harmony with all life." The night before the ceremony, Jake barely slept. He kept thinking about his parents back in Ohio, who would probably never understand how their quiet, bookish son had ended up being adopted into an Apache family in the Arizona desert. He had called them to explain the situation, though he had simplified it considerably, describing it as a cultural exchange opportunity rather than the result of accidentally triggering ancient marriage laws. The ceremony began at dawn, with Jake joining Henry and several other male elders in a traditional sweat lodge purification ritual. The intense heat and steam, combined with rhythmic chanting in Apache, created an almost hallucinogenic state of consciousness that left Jake feeling both exhausted and strangely energized. After the sweat lodge, he was dressed in traditional Apache clothing that had been specially made for the occasion by the women of the family. The intricate beadwork and symbolic patterns on the shirt and leggings represented his new status and responsibilities within the clan. Looking at himself in a mirror, Jake barely recognized the serious-faced man staring back at him. The main ceremony took place in the community center, which had been transformed with traditional decorations and filled with members of not just Ayana's immediate family, but the broader Apache community. Jake was amazed to see how many people had come to witness his adoption, some traveling from distant parts of the reservation to participate in this unusual event. Ayana looked radiant in her own ceremonial dress, her role as his sister, now officially recognized by the community. She smiled encouragingly at him as he took his place in the circle of family members who would formally accept him into their clan. The ceremony itself was conducted entirely in Apache, with David providing whispered translations to help Jake understand the significance of each element. There were prayers to the four directions, offerings of sacred tobacco and corn pollen, and the recitation of genealogies that traced the family's
lineage back through generations of Apache.
Leaders and medicine people. The most moving moment came when Henry Yazzie placed his hands on Jake's head and spoke directly to the spirits of their ancestors, asking them to accept this white man as a true son of the Apache people. Jake couldn't understand the words, but the emotion in the elderly man's voice was unmistakable. This wasn't just a legal formality. It was a spiritual transformation that Henry believed would literally change Jake's soul. When it came time for Jake to speak, he had prepared remarks in both English and the Apache phrases that Ayanna had taught him. His pronunciation was terrible, but the effort was appreciated by the gathered families who applauded warmly when he attempted to express his gratitude in their language. "I never expected to find family in the desert," Jake said in English, "but that's exactly what happened. I'm honored to be accepted into this community and to take on the responsibilities that come with being Ayanna's brother. I promise to do my best to be worthy of the trust you're placing in me." Following the formal ceremony, there was a feast that lasted well into the evening. Jake found himself overwhelmed by the warmth and acceptance shown by people who had been strangers just a week earlier. Children who had been shy around him at first now treated him like any other family member, and the elders shared stories and jokes that helped him understand the lighter side of Apache culture. As the celebration continued, Jake realized that something profound had indeed changed within him. Whether it was the psychological impact of the ritual or something more mystical, he felt a genuine sense of belonging that he had never experienced before. The solitary life that had once satisfied him now seemed incomplete compared to the rich network of relationships he was becoming part of. Late in the evening, as most of the families began to head home, Ayanna found Jake sitting quietly outside the community center, looking up at the star-filled desert sky. "How do you feel?" she asked, settling down beside him on the wooden steps. "Different," Jake replied honestly. "I feel like I've been carrying something I didn't know I was missing, and now it's been filled." "Does that make sense?" Ayanna nodded. "That's what my grandmother says happens during a true adoption ceremony. You're not just joining our family legally. You're becoming part of our spiritual community. The ancestors have accepted you, and now you carry their protection and their expectations." Jake looked at this remarkable young woman who had inadvertently changed his entire life trajectory. "Are you okay with all this? I mean, you're stuck with me as a brother now, whether you like it or not." Ayanna laughed, a sound that reminded Jake of wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "I think I got lucky. You're probably going to be the most scientifically educated member of our family, and having a botanist as a brother might come in handy when I'm working on traditional medicine projects in nursing school." As they sat together in comfortable silence, watching meteor streaks across the vast sky, Jake reflected on the chain of events that had brought him to this moment. A wrong turn in the desert, a young woman's cry for help, and a simple act of sharing water had led him to discover a family and a culture that he never knew he needed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as he figured out how to balance his old life with his new responsibilities, but tonight he was content to simply enjoy the profound sense of belonging that had taken root in his heart during the ceremony. For the first time in his adult life, Jake Mitchell was truly part of something larger than himself. 6 months after the adoption ceremony, Jake found himself living a life that straddled two worlds in ways he had never imagined possible. He had kept his promise to help document traditional plant medicine, spending several days each month on the reservation working with Apache healers to create a comprehensive database of medicinal flora native to the Sonoran Desert. The project had grown beyond anything he had initially envisioned. The National Science Foundation had approved funding for a multi-year collaboration between Jake's botanical expertise and traditional Apache knowledge, recognizing the potential for groundbreaking research in ethnobotany. What had started as a gesture of goodwill toward his new family had become the most meaningful work of his career. Ayanna had returned to nursing school in Phoenix, but she visited the reservation regularly and often served as a cultural interpreter for Jake's research. Their relationship as ceremonial siblings had developed into a genuine friendship, based on mutual respect and shared interests in healing traditions. She was particularly excited about the possibility of integrating traditional plant remedies with modern medical practices. "My great-grandmother knew which plants could stop bleeding, reduce fever, and ease pain. Ayana explained to Jake as they collected specimens in the desert where they had first met, but she didn't know why they worked. Your research is helping us understand the science behind the traditional knowledge, which makes it more likely to be accepted by modern healthcare providers. The transformation in Jake's personal life was equally dramatic. The man who had once preferred solitude now found himself at the center of an extended family network that included dozens of cousins, aunts, uncles, and honorary relatives throughout the Apache community. His small apartment near the university had been supplemented by a trailer on the reservation that served as his home base during research trips. Henry Yazzie had become like a father to Jake, sharing not just spiritual guidance but practical wisdom about navigating the complex relationship between Native American communities and the outside world. The elderly medicine man was particularly pleased that Jake's scientific work was bringing positive attention to Apache culture and helping preserve traditional knowledge for future generations. "You understand something that many outsiders do not," Henry told Jake during one of their regular conversations. "Our traditions are not museum pieces to be studied and displayed. They are living wisdom that continues to evolve and adapt while maintaining its essential truth." Jake's relationship with his birth family had also evolved in unexpected ways. His parents had initially been bewildered by their son's sudden immersion in Apache culture. But when they visited the reservation for the first time, they were moved by the warmth and acceptance shown to them as Jake's family. His mother was particularly impressed by the strong role that elderly women played in Apache society, so different from the marginalization of seniors she had observed in mainstream American culture. The botanical research was yielding remarkable results. Jake and his Apache collaborators had identified several compounds that showed promise for treating diabetes, a disease that affected Native American communities at disproportionately high rates. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that traditional Apache medicine might hold keys to addressing health problems that had been exacerbated by the disruption of traditional lifestyles. One afternoon, while working with a group of Apache women to process samples of a particularly promising medicinal plant, Jake received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Sarah Chen, a pharmaceutical researcher from a major drug company, had driven down from Phoenix to discuss the commercial potential of their discoveries. "We're prepared to offer significant funding for further research and development," Dr. Chen explained during a meeting that included Jake, Henry Yazzie, and several tribal council members. "The compounds you've identified could be worth millions of dollars in pharmaceutical applications." The meeting grew tense as the discussion turned to intellectual property rights and profit sharing. Jake watched Henry's face carefully, knowing that the medicine man was weighing the potential benefits against the risks of commercializing sacred knowledge. "Our plants are not commodities to be bought and sold," Henry finally said. "They are gifts from the Creator that are meant to heal all people, not to make profits for corporations." The negotiations that followed took weeks and required input from tribal lawyers, federal officials, and academic institutions. Jake found himself serving as a bridge between worlds, helping to craft an agreement that would allow beneficial research to continue while ensuring that the Apache Nation retained control over their traditional knowledge and received fair compensation for any commercial applications. The final agreement established the first Native American-controlled pharmaceutical development cooperative, with profits from any successful drugs to be shared equally between the Apache Nation and Jake's research institution. More importantly, the Apache retained veto power over how their traditional knowledge could be used and required that any medications developed would be provided at cost to Native American communities. This could be a model for how indigenous knowledge and modern science can work together respectfully, Ayana observed as the agreements were signed in a ceremony that blended traditional Apache protocols with modern legal formalities. As Jake's second year as an adopted Apache family member began, he reflected on how profoundly his life had changed since that fateful day in the desert. The lonely botanical researcher who had stumbled upon a dying girl had been transformed into a bridge between cultures, helping to preserve and honor traditional wisdom while contributing to cutting-edge scientific research. The most profound change, however, was personal. Jake had discovered that family wasn't just about blood relationships, but about commitment, mutual support, and shared values. His Apache relatives had taught him that true strength came not from independence, but from understanding his place in the web of relationships that connected all life. On weekends, when he wasn't conducting research, Jake often returned to the spot in the desert where he had found Ayana. The place that had once seemed like a barren wasteland now revealed itself to be teeming with life and interconnections that were invisible to casual observers. Desert plants that appeared separate were actually connected by vast underground root networks that shared water and nutrients during times of stress. "Everything is connected," he would repeat, Henry's words to himself, understanding them now in ways that went far beyond botanical science. His accidental act of sharing water had connected him to a family, a culture, and a purpose that had transformed not just his career, but his understanding of what it meant to be human. Standing in the desert at sunset, watching the mountains glow with the same light that had witnessed his first meeting with Ayana, Jake felt grateful for the wrong turn that had led him to exactly where he needed to be. Sometimes the most important journeys began with getting lost, and sometimes the most meaningful families were the ones you never saw coming.